Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. One of the biggest strategic undercurrents right now is how exposed the wider European system is becoming to pressure points connected to this war. Legal and political friction around energy infrastructure continues to surface, especially with investigations tied to the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. That case has now moved into formal legal proceedings in Germany, keeping one of Europe's most sensitive energy security episodes firmly in the spotlight. At the same time, there is rising tension inside the coalition supporting Ukraine. Poland has publicly raised concerns about stalled technology exchanges tied to drone capabilities and aircraft transfers, signaling that even among close partners, expectations around wartime cooperation are becoming more complicated and more transactional. Elsewhere in Europe's periphery, Georgia is accelerating a shift away from Russian crude in its refining system, explicitly aiming to reduce exposure to sanctions risk. Ireland is facing scrutiny over industrial inputs that may connect into Russian aluminum production chains, with broader EU-level discussion about whether those flows should be more tightly controlled. And across all of this, sanctions policy continues to evolve from targeting finished goods to targeting inputs, materials, and supply chain nodes. So what you are seeing here is not just sanctions expansion. It is a tightening of the entire industrial perimeter around Russia. Now zoom into Ukraine and Russia directly, because this is where the pressure loop becomes very visible. Ukraine's deep strike campaign continues to expand in both range and consistency, and the effects are increasingly structural rather than symbolic. Ukrainian forces have repeatedly struck Russian energy infrastructure, including major refining facilities and fuel logistics hubs deep inside Russian territory. Sites tied to oil processing in regions like Bashkortostan and Nizhny Novgorod have been hit, along with facilities linked to missile components, aviation systems, and broader defense industrial production. What makes this significant is not any single target, but the pattern forming across the system. Russia is still exporting crude oil at scale, but it is increasingly having to manage a mismatch between upstream production and downstream refining capacity. That gap is now large enough that Russia has begun importing refined fuel, including gasoline shipments sourced from India. In other words, a major energy exporter is simultaneously leaning on external refined imports to stabilize internal consumption and logistics demand. That is a structural pressure point, not a temporary disruption. And it connects directly into what is happening inside Russia's logistics and military system. Reports from frontline sectors continue to point to fuel strain in certain areas, particularly in northern operational zones. Russian units in some cases are rationing fuel for generators and limiting vehicle movement under threat of drone surveillance and strike risk. That has forced a shift toward more constrained movement patterns, and in some cases, heavier reliance on foot-based logistics for localized operations. This matters because logistics is the connective tissue of sustained offensive operations. When it becomes uneven or constrained, tempo drops even if manpower is available. Now layer this onto the battlefield situation itself. Russian forces continue to conduct offensive operations across multiple sectors in eastern and northern Ukraine, but the pattern remains consistent: incremental gains, heavy attrition, and limited operational breakthroughs. Even where infiltration tactics are successful, consolidation tends to lag behind, and Ukrainian counterattacks frequently disrupt attempts to stabilize forward positions. The result is a front line that is highly active but strategically static. Movement exists, but it is fragmented rather than decisive, and the cost of that fragmentation is rising. Russian casualty levels remain high relative to territorial gains, creating a sustained imbalance between input and output. In simple terms, Russia is spending a large amount of force to achieve relatively limited changes in control on the ground. Over time, that kind of exchange rate becomes strategically relevant because it affects force regeneration, training pipelines, and equipment replacement cycles. Now pull back again because the air and industrial domain is reinforcing this pressure in a different way. Russia's aviation sector is under sustained strain across both military and civilian systems. Strategic aircraft readiness is declining due to maintenance constraints, sanctions limiting access to components, and increasing operational wear from sustained use. Older platforms are increasingly being cannibalized to keep a smaller number of aircraft operational, and modernization timelines are stretching significantly. On the civilian side, repeated incidents tied to mechanical failures and system degradation suggest broader stress across aviation maintenance ecosystems. Engine reliability, hydraulic systems, and avionics support chains are all areas showing strain under current conditions. The strategic implication here is straightforward. Long-range air capability becomes more expensive, less reliable, and harder to scale under sustained pressure. Now add the alliance and intelligence layer, because this is where the conflict is increasingly shaping European security architecture. Information operations targeting Ukraine's European trajectory continue to expand in sophistication. Coordinated influence networks are pushing narratives designed to exploit economic anxiety, historical sensitivities, and political polarization across different EU member states. The goal is not just misinformation in isolation, but persistent erosion of trust in Ukraine's integration path into Europe. At the same time, Russian defense sector messaging has become more explicit in framing long-term confrontation scenarios involving NATO. Drone development communities inside Russia are openly discussing preparation for large-scale future conflict environments, which reflects how wartime innovation is increasingly being framed in generational terms rather than short-term campaigns. This is important because it shows the war is not just producing battlefield adaptation, but doctrinal and industrial repositioning on multiple sides. There is also a quieter but important development around military and technical cooperation dynamics beyond the immediate theater. Reporting continues to indicate expanded interaction between Russia and China in specialized defense-related training areas, including sensitive domains like chemical, biological, and radiological defense. These are not headline deployments, but they do point toward incremental knowledge sharing that shapes long-term capabilities. It does not indicate direct battlefield alignment. What it does indicate is parallel modernization with areas of overlap that matter over time. Now bring this back to Europe's immediate security environment. NATO members along the eastern flank continue to express concern about hybrid pressure risks. That includes information operations, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and potential sabotage scenarios targeting politically or economically sensitive systems. Maritime security in the Baltic region remains another pressure point, where commercial and state-linked activity is increasingly viewed through a strategic lens rather than purely economic terms. Even routine infrastructure decisions are now being interpreted through security framing. And finally, there is one more layer that ties all of this together: internal enforcement and state control inside Russia itself. Reporting continues to show an expansion of prosecutions and internal security cases tied to espionage, sabotage, and cooperation with external intelligence services. These cases serve a dual purpose. They reinforce internal discipline, and they signal that infrastructure and information environments are now fully integrated into national security doctrine. At the same time, civilian systems like aviation, logistics, and fuel distribution are all showing incremental strain under cumulative pressure. None of these systems are collapsing, but they are all operating with less flexibility than before. Thank you for listening and for contributing to the growth of this community. If you found the show valuable, a review or a thoughtful comment helps extend its reach to others. For more in-depth analysis, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack, restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Take care and have a great day.